Workforce and Family Program over here at New America, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion here of the politics of parental leave. Is paid parental leave an effective means of promoting gender equity in the workplace? One of the big concerns that we've been focusing on now as part of our next social contract project at New America is looking a bit at the different rights and responsibilities of different actors in our economy and in our workplace and in our family lives, and trying to figure out how everything sort of fits together in our world. We released a paper a few weeks ago that looked at work-life balance and the stress on health, the impacts on children and parents of that stress, and the place that workplace flexibility plays in that. The paper's up on our website and will be released more broadly shortly. This is a good week, I think, to be having this particular discussion a bit on paid leave and on how it fits in with the broader scheme of thinking about workplace flexibility, and in particular workplace equity, because earlier this week you had John Edwards release a plan that looked a little bit at expanding FMLA and how we might do some things in an area that we care a lot about, and that built on Senator Obama's plan from earlier in the month and Senator Clinton's plan from earlier in the fall. So there's a lot of attention by presidential candidates looking specifically at paid parental leave. In addition, as you know, there are bills in Congress that take a look at how to different aspects of comp time and flex time, and paid leave is a common alternative offered. And so when we try to think about the solutions that our no social contract should have, we have a lot to work with, and there's a lot of attention being paid at the presidential, at the congressional, and certainly at the individual level to this issue. And so we're glad that you could join us for this discussion of this issue today. One thing that I've always enjoyed in working with Charmaine and some of her insights on a variety of issues is both the breadth that she has to talk, communicate on many topics, but also the depth from her commitment and research to issues such as the flexibility of balancing the challenges of balancing life. Perspective she brings as a researcher and a thinker, as well as a mother. And so I was thrilled when I had an opportunity to look at some of her research that looked at the academy, a place where if we think paid leave has a particular opportunity to be successful, academy would be one that would show that. And diving down into some of the numbers about the impacts of paid leave in that venue and what that might say for its application more broadly. We are just really thrilled that she would take time to be with us today. So let me introduce Charmaine and then turn it over to her, and then as we think about both her research and dialogue with you through Q&A, or talk more broadly about some of the other plans, or think about how we keep the economy growing while doing some things that can benefit workers, we would love to have that dialogue with you over the next hour after Charmaine does her presentation. Dr. Charmaine Yoest is the Vice President of Communications of the Family Research Council, where she oversees their strategic communications. She's an author, a political analyst, an expert on a variety of social policy issues, a regular commentator. I see her on TV all the time. The author of Mother in the Middle, an examination of work and family and childcare policy. Charmaine's also provided testimony to both the House and the Senate. Her blog, Reason Audacity, was a finalist for the 05 and 06 Web Blog Awards. And during her graduate work, and this is important to this particular project, Charmaine served as the project director for the Family, Gender, and Tenure Project at the Department of Politics at UVA, which is a nationwide study funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which helped put together some of the research that she's going to talk about today. So with that broad perspective and introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Charmaine for her presentation, and then look forward to getting a chance to dialogue. So,
Thank you so much, David. Does this pick me up? Okay, great, because obviously you can tell I'm going to kind of need it today. Let me just echo David's comments. Frankly, I'm stunned to see you all. I expected there to be maybe 3 people here at the most. I figured we'd have a very casual, fun conversation about parental leave, but you all clearly got out the paddles and rowed to get here. So I'm very grateful to that, and I further appreciate your tolerance of my. Well, we'll try to generally term it as my husky voice. I hope it won't be too annoying to listen to for too long. So, does this preview? No, that's okay. Okay, and I just hit the right one. Okay, all right. David's already mentioned, but I just want to underscore in terms of giving credit where credit is due. Even though I'm at the FRC now, this was part of my doctoral dissertation research that was funded by the Sloan Foundation and the Bankard Fund at UVA. And we, as our team got started looking at parental leave, I said it in the broader context, and today hope to do so as well, of gender equity. But we were looking specifically at the policy because, as you all know, the United States is one of the few developed countries that does not mandate paid leave. Instead, we have unpaid leave. And so, but there is such a trend towards talking more about paid leave, and with California's passage of paid leave in 2002, that really kind of ramped it up. So we decided, being academics and looking around us and seeing kind of an unusual situation in that there are so many situations where there is paid leave in academia. So that makes the university setting in America kind of unusual in that you have what I'm calling a crucial case. Is David also did mention this, in that if there's going to really be any place in America where you would expect paid leave to work, it would be academia. Over the last 20 years, there's been a very vibrant debate over how there can be better retention and promotion of women within the academy. And, you know, all political discussions aside, I think we can all agree that generally speaking, you're going to find people who are more receptive to the idea of paid leave and female advancement than really any other place. Very few other sectors of our society. And then lastly, another point that I would make as to why we were interested in looking at female academics is that we felt like the tenure track system was fairly representative of the work-family challenge that women confront across, you know, a host of different professional tracks. Whether you look at women in the law who are trying to make partner, whether you look at the residency system in the medical arena, you know, the tenure track system mimics that in women in their 30s, women in general do have kind of a crunch period. And so we felt like the academic setting gave us a good setting there to experiment and look at this policy. David also mentioned the fact that I just thought it was such a great irony that we would be talking about this issue just this week when Senator Edwards came out with his policy proposal of universal paid family leave. So it's very aggressive, very, very aggressive with, 8 weeks paid time off for all American workers. I haven't looked at it very closely, but I did think that was pretty sweeping, and it does appear to go beyond what anybody else it has out there. But the price tag is $2 billion, so it is very big. Here I would just want to show you a little bit about underscoring this question of the need for some kind of, to talk about the challenges that women face in the workplace. So we wanted to look and see what the proportion of female faculty was at the different levels in academia, and this really isn't going to surprise you. If we look first at the professor at your top level, at the very most prestigious schools, you're looking at 12-13%, and then excuse me, I'm going the wrong direction. So, this isn't going to be terribly surprising to you. And then more women going down the ranks until you get to the instructor level, which clearly women are much more highly represented in the instructor level. So the fundamental question that we really wanted to address then is, you very frequently hear this phrase thrown out when people talk about paid leave as leveling the playing field. As women, I mean, that's really what we want, isn't it, is to be treated the same and for there to just be able to compete on a level playing field. So how do you a little version control here, but that's okay. I like to set this in the context of the broader question of women's gender equity, and to remind people that this question goes back a very, very long way. At the turn of the century, Virginia Woolf was saying, what is the state of mind that is most propitious to the act of creation? To write a work of genius is almost always a feat of prodigious difficulty. Generally, material circumstances are against it. Dogs will bark, people will interrupt, money must be made, health will break down. But for women, these difficulties were infinitely more formidable. In the first place, to have a room of her own was out of the question. The first time I read this piece by Virginia Woolf, I was so struck by it, by the fact that it really is such a long time ago, that she really just zoomed right in on the central issue, is that women do have different responsibilities and pulls on them than men do. And so that really kind of formed the basis of my inquiry as we look at parental leave and how these kind of differing and competing priorities for men and women affect us in the workplace. So we went out and we did 2 surveys. The first one was an institutional survey of 162 colleges and universities across the country to see what their policies were, because nobody actually, before we did this, knew what exactly was out there in terms of paid leave. And I'm not really going to talk about that survey much today, but just so that you know that that data is there. And then we did an individual survey of 109 men and 79 women. We defined paid leave as being at least 6 weeks of full relief from teaching duties, full pay and half relief from teaching duties, and half pay and full relief for teaching duties for 1 full semester. We focused in on assistant professors because they're the ones who have, the greatest pressures on the tenure track. And so in order to be included in the survey, you had to have children under the age of 2, be in a tenure track position, and be at institutions with paid leave policies. The very first thing that astonished us was, keeping in mind now, every single one of the men and women in our survey had the opportunity in front of them to take paid leave. So it was parental leave. It wasn't maternity leave. It was parental leave. So both men and women had exactly the same opportunity to take this leave, and only 12% of the men utilized the leave. So what you're looking at, and this really was the single most surprising finding that we had, that men would walk away from basically money on the table and just leave it sitting there. That for whatever reason, they didn't utilize it. Taking that one step further, though, because the discrepancy between the men and the women is so dramatic, I think sometimes we tend to miss the fact that actually 30% of the women in our sample also left that money sitting on the table. And this one really surprised me, that a woman with the opportunity to take a leave with no adverse effects would leave that sitting there. So how do we operationalize this question of leveling the playing field? What kinds of things did we look at in the survey? The first thing we asked was that if paid leave is going to be, if it's effective, then shouldn't we see universities that have paid leave policies having higher percentages of female professors? Because that's the ultimate goal, right? That's why you have these 20 years of discussion of, what are we going to do to help women? The outcome should be that you have more female professors. What we found was pretty much that it was exactly the same between paid leave and unpaid leave schools, which again really did surprise us. Now I will tell you is that once I went in and did what people who've read my dissertation tell me is an extremely boring section of multivariate regression, and looked at it, cut it 10 million different ways. And once we controlled it for rank and type of institution, the paid leave policies did correlate with slightly higher percentages of female professors. I'd like to show you this graph, though, because I feel like that's a question that really needs to be looked at more closely, because it was very marginal, and it was very close to statistically insignificant. It was significant, but it wasn't a very big result at all. So just, in fairness, to tell you that once we started controlling for some things, we did see a tiny, tiny little shift. But the troubling thing was that once you saw that shift, you also saw a depression in the female-male pay ratio. So one started to wonder if there was a trade-off going on there. The next question that we looked at was, and some people don't quite get the framing of this, but the idea of the level playing field is that if you give paid leave to somebody, the woman, then the idea is that she would come back after the leave and be able to have the level playing field. She'd be able to function basically like a man, be able to do and in academia this is research and writing. So the idea is to kind of, in a sense, nullify the pregnancy event and put it in a box and say, okay, we're going to deal with it, put it over here, and then you're going to rock and roll when you come back. So our question then was, when you came back from your leave, can you compare and contrast for us what your life was like in terms of research and writing before you took the leave and what it was like afterwards when you came back? What we found, and this again surprised me because I was kind of expecting there to be a gender difference, but what we found is that it's really the leave takers who reported that they had less time, regardless of gender. So if you're a male leave taker, you're looking more like the female leave taker in your response to this question than the female non-leave taker. But this won't surprise you. The female leave takers reported the worst loss of time of everybody. So this is what it looked like. You see the female leave takers way off there on the left, and this is the one that's particularly troubling, I think, is that 65% of female leave takers saying that they had a lot less time. So, male leave takers are not on here because they were basically, they threw my graph off and they were 100% over on the left-hand side. So basically they look just like the female leave takers. So the next question then is, okay, so we're not really terribly surprised maybe that that paid leave isn't going to help with the post-research question. But you would hope that it would alleviate enough stress among both male and female leave takers that they would be able to feel that there'd be psychic income from this, that they would feel less stress in terms of their career. So we asked them whether or not, whether or not they've considered dropping off the tenure track. And what we found here, again, was a leave difference that was more significant than a gender difference. And leave takers, the majority of them said they had thought about dropping, or thinking of dropping off the tenure track compared to those who had not taken leave. And this did not, also didn't correlate with level of university that you were at either, which was, again, surprising because I thought once we controlled for that this would kind of go away, and it didn't. So then we asked him, okay, well, what's your perception about the policy and whether or not it helped you with, was it effective in terms of helping you achieve tenure, since that's the ultimate goal. And what we found there was that most of them reported that it really didn't make any difference at all. Now, I see some of you looking back at me and going, well, yeah, they're not making a direct line connection between being able to take a leave and make tenure. But what troubled me is the people there to the left who felt that it might have hurt in some way. And those are small numbers, so I don't want to make too big a deal out of it. But I just would draw your attention to it because it kind of goes into my next point, which was the real issue of concern, I think, with parental leave is this question of stigma. I can't tell you that we found a real good way to explore stigma. I'm sure you guys are more than familiar with the literature on stigma. It's pretty hard to nail down. But we did ask in both the institutional survey and in the what we did was with the institutional survey, we went and talked to the administrators. And I love this one. I think this is kind of hilarious. So we asked the administrators, did they encounter any bias at all? And I was just amused that 100% of them said no, which of course they would. But we did get quite a few anecdotal responses back. So they weren't willing to say yes to the straight-on question, but in terms of the anecdotal responses, they said, well, there was this person who had this problem and this person who had that problem, so there was a disconnect there. And again, trying to kind of get at this. Again, not wanting to overblow this because I'm not saying it's huge evidence. You can tell where I've gotten criticism on this in the past. This is not huge. But here's what is a little troubling is when you looked at, and I truncated this because I think the disagreement is the only part that's really interesting about it, is so you get 38% of men disagreeing and 30% of women disagreeing. But look at this. 49% of men strongly disagreeing, so less than half, and 64% of women. And I just look at that, and given the fact that that is a statistically significant gender difference, I think that, to me, starts to get at a little bit of what concerns me about parental leave, is this difference in male and female perceptions about how it works and how it might affect people. So let me just run real quickly through, and actually I'm going to go with what's in front of me, which isn't going to be exactly the same as on here because my last changes didn't get saved up here, and so some of these results I haven't talked about with you. So the first result was that the policy is only marginally associated with higher percentages of females, and that leave-taking women have less time for research and writing, and that leave-taking women are more likely to think about dropping off the tenure track. And then both male and female leave takers believe that the policy has little effect on tenure. And then some of the survey responses showed evidence of stigma, but there was a strong anecdotal evidence of stigma. And we had a section in the individual survey where we got free-form responses from people, and that's where we started to see more of people volunteering stories of people taking leave and then having a problem later on. So I've kind of run through an awful lot of data. It was hard to make choices about what I wanted to put in front of you today. But I'm just going to go ahead and give you some of my conclusions because I figured then I can throw more evidence at you depending on which parts of these conclusions you find interesting or not. What some of the conclusions that we drew from this was, I see a challenge with paid leave is having it operate as a political fig leaf, as something that can be put out there as a solution that doesn't ultimately help women as much as people think it does. And if there is a discrepancy between people's perception of assistance and the actual assistance, then you may have done more harm than good. And so, that's why I wanted to emphasize some of these marginal results. I might be wrong, and maybe the results will be bigger in other surveys. But if we're getting only marginal results and the price tag is as high as it could be, there might be other ways of approaching this problem that are a better investment. My conclusion then is that it's not that paid, and I want to emphasize this because sometimes people misunderstand my conclusion on this point. I don't conclude from this that paid parental leave is a bad thing. We saw quite a bit of evidence that it has worked for individual women. So the conclusion then would be that it may be necessary but not sufficient. Also, I think what you see coming out in this data about research and writing and the lingering effects and the challenges for women coming back to the workforce is that there is a disconnect between the needs of women facing childbirth and coming back into the workforce and the policy design. And then lastly, this unrealistic expectation angle that I don't think a whole lot of people talk about because there does seem to be so little understanding of the real needs of the post-childbirth period. And then lastly, going to this question of stigma is the concern of unintended consequences of putting the policy in place and merely entrenching gender bias that the policy is intended to alleviate. So thanks very much for your attention. I can't wait to hear your questions because I'm seeing so many interesting expressions on your faces. So let's have at it.
Thanks very much, Charmaine. It's an important question, and your presence here shows you care about it. And it's an important contribution of data looking at this area. Let me just start with two things by way of questions. First is just in thinking about the equity issue another way, which is just on class for just a second. Intentionally focusing on higher education, almost by definition, is an educated class. And I'm wondering just more broadly, from your experience looking at other surveys, the applicability of this, or what you found in terms of low-income workers as it relates to the data. And then secondly, I think about, as you talk about, the mix of solutions that would be helpful in the necessary, not sufficient point. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on career reentry or telecommuting or workplace flexibility more generally as it relates to this in terms of a panoply of solutions that might be offered. So. We'll start with that.
I'm really glad you brought up the question of focusing on professional women because I skipped over that entirely. There was a lot of thought that went into that and rationale, and it was twofold. And it's partly why I bring in the Virginia Woolf quote in the beginning, is because we framed it entirely in the context of professional women, partly for focus. That's a boring starting point as to why. You can't tackle everything. But there were two other reasons, one philosophical and then the third one being sort of practical. From a philosophical perspective, this gives, by focusing on professional women, it gives the opportunity to set the data in the context of the debate over gender equity. And parental leave gets talked about in a host of different ways, but it is very frequently used in that context. And so that was one reason. The third reason actually is a little more significant to me, is that I feel that when it comes to work-family policies, there really is a trickle-down effect of public policy, is that public policies are so often framed around the needs of elite women, and then they trickle down to working-class women who and the needs do not necessarily always coincide. But we can be certain that if a policy doesn't work for elite women who have more resources to ameliorate the issues involved with parenting, it's definitely going to be more of a challenge for working class women.
What about the broader things of how this might fit in with other solutions? Do you have any thoughts on career reentry or workplace flex or telecommuting, that use any of those that spike as particularly promising?
We did see responses coming back from the women of, particularly when we explored with them, these women who said they thought about dropping off the tenure track of, where would you go, what else would you do? There was definitely coming back as, completely in line with other survey data that they would look for going to a situation, if they were going to get off the tenure track, it would be for greater flexibility. With the caveat that there was a category of women who, and these ones, I just wanted to have the opportunity to interview them more in depth, because they were like, I'm going to move to a more intense place. So actually, I'm conflating. There were two tandem questions. One was, would you drop off, and the second one was, where would you go? So there was this core group of women who were like, if you're going to leave this place, where would you go? And they're like, I'm going somewhere bigger and better. So more power to them.
Very good. All right. Well, let's dialogue here. Any questions for Charmaine? Sir.
I looked at this two ways. If I was a member of your thesis committee, I remember the same process. So I'm sympathetic to the methodology that you used, which is a small sample size, but for a person doing their own research or relying on others, I understand that. But I would also say, I'm sympathetic in terms of the thesis, but in terms of a policy application, I see very little, if any, application of policy, starting with your methodology. Your charts, when you were talking about utilization rates with women, use a little, not a little. I mean, you're talking about a sample size, as I recall, of about 80. So that means that 2 people or 3 people could have dropped the figure from 23% to 19 or up to 29. So I don't think it has any application at all. Also, I would say in terms of your thesis, of what was your assumptions based on the data, you started with an assumption, as I understand it, that this was going to help, quote unquote, level the playing field. And that to me is an assumption that it's one of 100 things it might do it in terms of women, in terms of gender. But you made this a thesis of your research that this was a primary possibility to level the playing field, and I would say it has some application to even elite women in university settings, but very little. And then at the end, to say basically that because this process might attach some stigma to it, that maybe women shouldn't pursue it, that would be like telling the black in the 60s they shouldn't register to vote, having given the chance in the Civil Rights Act, because there might be some stigma in their community. And I don't see how that's supported by any of the data that you portrayed for us, and basically belies your political ideology.
Okay, so since you know who I am, can I know who you are?
Yeah, my name is Phil Sparks, and I'm with something called the Communications Consortium, and I am one of the 12% in your chart that took family.
Oh, did you?
Back then, too.
Okay, well, you certainly gave me quite a few things to address. First off, it's not just my thesis committee, although one of the members of my committee was our premier statistician in our department, who was educated at, his degree is from Michigan. So, you know, and this was it wasn't just my dissertation research. I was the project director of a Sloan Foundation funded major national study. So, small sample size, well, you know, show me another study with a larger sample size, and that's why I said, you know, it's a start. And here's where your point is an interesting one, is that one of the challenges we faced was finding men who had taken leave in order to get to statistical significance. Our deadlines had to keep getting backed up because it was so hard to find those men. So I'm pretty proud of our methodology, actually. I think I'm not saying it covers the waterfront, but I'm saying that it gives some really interesting information that you're not going to find elsewhere. In terms of the validity of framing it in terms of leveling the playing field, the reason that we did that was to engage with the debate going on, and it's not just in academia, but it's in the country at large, is that one of the reasons for being of this policy is to help women level the playing field. You can find it in the literature. It's a major pillar. It's not the only reason for it, and you know it needs to be, and usually is, married with conversation about childcare. But you know, we're focusing on parental leave to look specifically at parental leave. So.
I find it interesting, just having been at DOL just after this, if you're talking about the 2099 survey on parental leave, when we came in there and looked at that, one thing that was always interesting to me and we talked about doing a different follow-up study to that, is trying to find significant studies that looked at the impact of parental leave. And so when we're trying to figure out now as a country, you know, we're entering a period where this is probably, hopefully, going to be a more ripe debate. And so part of my thought is there's not enough research on any aspect of the implication and application of parental leave to try and put together a broader conclusion. So, you know, the DOL data we had was significant, but I think Charmaine's and others who are doing research in this area are very timely, you know, and very timely, because this is a debate that's gone underneath the radar for a while. Now that it's going to come above the radar, I think it's really important to look at whatever studies that have, you know, bring different segments to light, or narrow or broad, or et cetera, so that we can try to apply those to, you know, to policy. And whether or not, I mean, at some point DOL will probably update that study. I would imagine that will happen sometime in the next 4 years, let's sort of say. But anyway, so I think there's some strong applications. You raised a good question on the methodology. Yeah.
I
Mhm. 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 Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why I mentioned this question about money, is because I just want to I just want to ask the question of, I think we should be careful about putting this series of policies out there as the Holy Grail, because once, it's kind of fun to present this to people who live in Washington, D.C., as opposed to academics, because we all live in a world of real politics where everything comes at a price in terms of, and I don't mean monetarily, but politically. You got to choose what you're going to fight for politically. So, what are you going to invest in from that perspective? And there was, and it's not coming back to me just at the moment, but broadly speaking, there was a real correlation, you won't be surprised to find out, between the financial situation of the family unit and, these men who are able to take the leave. They felt more confident that they could, you know, be the one to take the leave, as opposed to, men who weren't more comfortably situated. Yeah. 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 Sure. Oh, great. Okay. Thanks.
I guess I still just wondered, okay, so you're right, it's all about choices.
Mhm.
You want to put your money in, you definitely put your money in, or you want to put political capital. But still, even just sort of, again, thinking about it, like, obviously people have kids. And so, whether the John Edwards is the right answer,
Right.
I don't know, maybe if you could speak with, more generally on the immediate families and how you would envision public policy and,
Mhm. Well, part of the reason, as I mentioned earlier, we also did a section on tenure clock, which we have not yet had an opportunity to do a whole lot of analysis of that angle of the data. But, so that was a part of our agenda as well, is to look at it and go, well, how could you bring more flexibility into the academic setting? And would it be more helpful to extend the tenure clock, or do both, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would agree with you, and we were definitely seeing that, of women saying, I wish there were a way to, have more flexibility.
Mhm. It's interesting, before, I think about all of the different plans we've seen the last sort of 2 months sort of linked to your question, Katie, childcare to paid leave, right? So, I mean, Edwards and Clinton have CCDBG, and the Obama plan is on the childcare independent tax credit, I think. Maybe it's CCDBG also, but it's definitely has a tax credit component. Anyway, they all link, when they're doing the paid leave piece, it's always linked with the childcare piece right behind it, which is interesting to the point that I think Charmaine's making. The broader application of any of this stuff has to be sort of it fits to a larger, fits in with a larger piece. And I've heard her talk before a little bit about telecommuting, and the role that new technologies play in this is not insignificant too, which I think is sort of an interesting piece here. But I found that slide really interesting too, when you looked at the more folks who took equals more stress for whatever, and trying to then delineate what's behind that is obvious question, but it's a pretty interesting slide. I agree with you, Katie. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Chantel. Yeah. Yeah. You got the WF 2010 corner down there, Chantel.
All
Chantel's
right.
right in the center. Here they come.
That's great.
And we are located at Georgetown University Law Center, so
Yeah.
having been there now compared to, I was at a private law firm before I came over there. And what I'm really wondering about the experience academia over the past 2 years, one, why did you decide to start with academia? You had mentioned the tenure track position with your partner, and making that correlation, which I guess my question is, there's already quite a bit of workplace flexibility in academia compared to other situations, and have you taken this study and do you apply it to law firms, to you're looking at the professional
Yeah.
representative, and are you
Yeah.
going to go forward with that research?
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure how to work in those areas if the workplaces are that similar.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting question. I used to have some fascinating conversations with people with that because I can tell you that academic women don't necessarily perceive it that way. Obviously, there is a certain motivation to be in academia because of the sort of greater flexibility, but the professional pressure in terms of research and writing is so intense that their perception of their flexibility is not high. And so I'm not going to just yeah, I wouldn't dispute it with you because, you know, that was, I found, but, you know, even so, I mean, it goes to your point about, you know, blowing off the question of stigma. I found as a woman in academia, and I'm 100% positive that this is a shared experience, is that, you know, the psychic expectations around you, as in any workplace, are affected by maternity and childcare, childbearing. You know, there's very much of an expectation to stash your kids and have them not, you know, be seen or heard from. So I think that kind of comes into that flexibility question as well. Kind of my head's still kind of wanting to tie in your two questions in terms of why I wanted to frame it this way is, again, going to the expectation game. And if women are struggling with the research angle and there is this need for flexibility, the challenge I see is parental leave not getting at in its defining of the question, you know. So, does that make sense? Yeah, it ends up functioning as a bracketing. You know, there is, and you know, so we asked this question, you know, how did you function once you came back? Because there's this expectation that you will come back and you will be the same person. It's not I mean, it can function in a flexibility way, but it doesn't necessarily. It can actually function in exactly the opposite direction. Do you see my point? I mean, it's.
I guess I kind of look at, there's these different points in time, and certain folks, not another, just talked about this idea over the life course and that this flexibility and different time, and it feels like the key is whether it's student or anything, but the parental leave they seem to respond to almost at a very acute moment in life when you need a child or some type of solution. Whereas then there is a more kind of day-to-day, long-term flexibility as well. But I guess it seems like I guess I'm sort of struggling with one thing up.
Yeah. I can see why it kind of sounds that way. I don't really intend for it to be. I'm wanting to challenge us to think about how we frame the issue, and because so few people look at it this way, because we have made such progress in talking about flexibility, I want to challenge us all to take a little bit of time and think about the question, is it possible that Joan Williams did such a good job of of conceptualizing for us all the ideal worker construct. But then at the same time, we move forward and we march forward with, okay, so we're going to bring along parental leave, we're going to bring along child care as a way to enable women to challenge that. And I just want to question and say, let's be careful we're not using these policies to undergird that construct, to continue to perpetuate a male conception of workplace participation.
All right. For male conception of workplace stuff, we'll go to Mark Schmidt over here.
Hi, I'm a senior fellow here working on next social contract project. I'm interested in how your methodology, thinks of, draws even inferences about causation. For example, that leave takers are more likely to think about leaving academia. I mean, it seems to me, knowing a lot of academics, that there's sort of two types of people. There are people who are, full speed ahead, the torpedoes until I get tenure, and there are people who are, always thinking about be half in, half out, and presumably those people who are sort of half in, half out might be more likely to be leave takers.
Right.
That they're slightly, their lesser attachment to the academic
Sure.
base might be the cause rather than leave taking being the
Right,
cause,
right,
less
right.
attachment, and how you account for that. And then more generally, it seems to me like I don't live in the world of paid parental leave, but it seems to me that you're creating big expectations. You're making the statement about it being the Holy Grail. And it seems to me that it's if it's understood as one piece, and in particular, I mean, it's always seemed to me that using a very small sample size, but she might work in a company that had 6 months off, it made everything just go so smoothly that there was no, that she did say, that was an option, but I see plenty of women, it seems to me, with 6 weeks off, wind up dropping out for 3-4 years, where it's really hard to get back. Then you're really out. So it's a sort of safety valve, so your methodology doesn't look at people who actually didn't have those leave options and therefore failed out for 2 or 3 years. Those are people.
Yeah, we were wishing we could do that latter part, actually, as we were setting the whole thing up. But so many things I want to respond to all at once. I was trying, I hope it was obvious in my presentation, to be very careful about positing any kind of causation. I don't want to make huge claims here. But we did have a question that we used, and I'm not recalling exactly how we phrased it, but we looked at this question of ambition, of, how committed are you, where do you want to go, that kind of thing. And there just really wasn't, so I controlled for that in looking at this, and I just really was surprised to see that these were not less ambitious women that were giving us these responses. They really, because I mean, that's what I expected. I thought, oh yeah, well, okay, so these are your maternalists over here, and these are your hardcore careerist women over here, and it just didn't turn out that way. We had a whole nother series of ideological questions that were kind of designed to try and get at that, and given the fact that it was academia, there wasn't a broad range of responses, but in probing those kind of questions as well, do you think that a mother cares for her child better than a father? Things like that. We just didn't find there to be an ideological correlation with the responses either. So we were looking to make sure that there wasn't kind of a maternalist kind of bias to the responses that I'm giving you here. And then the second part of his question.
Second part, I think, was on this Holy Grail issue, right? The Monty Python question.
Yeah.
You've got, which I'd like to say. I mean, we got a pretty interesting focus group here for a second. We could, all three. So the Obama, Clinton, and Edwards press release all started with paid leave as the first of their plans in this area. I mean, it does seem to be that the issue is at some level about the intersection of time, and then how do you afford to take the time. So paid leave is at the intersection, therefore it becomes sort of the Holy Grail. But
Well, I don't see any
well,
of them, for example, claiming that paid leave would completely level the
The gender equity question, no.
Situation.
No.
Right.
No.
But it's an interesting
That's
slight,
a claim you're rebutting, but not a claim.
well, but it's a slice of it that I think is significant, though.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, that's sort of it's one sort of slice of why you sort of create sort of time is to create some flexibility for people to, to join and then come back without it detrimentally affecting their career, which is where higher education has particularly. All right, it's almost time for one more WF 2010 question, but Sharon, hold on one second. Shelley? Yeah.
Hi, Shelley Waters. I have a couple points. One is curiosity about whether or not you've asked me this question, but sort of outside of the gender equity issue around parental leave, one of the benefits that the research has done to kids for child attachment bonding and establishing breastfeeding and things like that, which we all know there are several well-respected studies, as you all know, that basically show a really positive outcome for kids and longer leave kind of taken by mothers, and whether or not you got at any questions with the mothers you interviewed about how they felt like these was maybe not necessarily, I think your chart was really insightful about not necessarily harmful, but not necessarily hurtful either, but if there was a positive benefit to the kids, they use that as a trade-off with me. So that's the first question. And then I just have this other general question about how we kind of think about the gender equity, thinking about your premise about gender equity, and knowing the research too that's shown that whether the policy is in place or not, that the way the firm, whether it be academics or business, actually implement it, the stigma and culture around it has a big deal. It creates a big impact on whether or not you actually are in fact and in some ways, I think it's hard to test that in the United States until it's a more universal program, because until there's a set of people who are both entitled and then expected to take it, it's really hard to get at whether or not we would eventually level playing field. I've been trying to dig the data out of California, actually, and what's going on with their use of parental leave, and it's still very new, but in the data that they've been able to share, they actually are showing it is nowhere near equal. But to me, I was surprised at the number of men who were taking parental leave at the onset of birth, and they can split that a lot differently. So I'm wondering if perhaps the problem is necessarily that we're looking at it at a policy that's at the firm level, and then extracting those lessons to what we've been talking about at the policy level, and we might actually see something differently if we have this. And I think like Janet Gornick's work and looking at some of the European countries, and again, it really depends on how you design your program, because some of the programs in European countries are not designed for gender equity, and she thinks that's a problem. But if you design the program that freely to be taken by both men and women, would you actually see some of the gender equity issues about internationally? So your thoughts on that? First, what am I had to say, and that would be helpful.
I guess that maybe you and I would have different perceptions on the tenor of the campus climate, but that really was what we were looking at, was why we called it a crucial case, is we really felt like this was a place where if there was anywhere you were going to be able to have positive peer pressure, it would be in academia. That was the hypothesis. Yeah. Because there's been such a discussion on college campuses about the problems surrounding female academics, there's high motivation to increase the representation of women in the academy. You're looking at me skeptically, but that was our perception.
If you could clarify, what surprised me, as I recall your slide, was the low male take-up.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you described later was a question in the slide for it was included in the question, in which you discovered that the male take-up related to a sense of economic capacity to take up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that strikes me as a big area. Maybe you have some more research underlying that, but it could well be that 90% or 95% of the explanation for why you're not which I agree is something we continually need to learn from, and perhaps can't, as we're just beginning to see this policy emerging
Yeah.
in the States. In the Euro countries, some of them, as Janet pointed
Yeah.
references, have a now a use or lose policy for males.
Right, right.
So that what we're seeing now as a result of those policies, which communicate to the employer that it's on them to deny,
Yeah.
they are in fact beginning to see much more,
Yeah.
not huge amounts, but more take-up of males.
Well,
So I guess the.
yeah, yeah. No, you may be right about that. I think there's definitely more digging that could be done on the whole economic side of things. I will tell you this though, and this is I'm gonna be pulling this out of my memory banks because this was not the data that I did hands-on myself. It was another member of the team. But we did a whole series of looking at the differences between how the men and women interacted with their children while they were on leave. And it was just, again, not that many of the men, but, there was one man in particular who, just freely admitted that he spent the whole time writing a book, And so that was, there was very definitely a gender difference there in terms of hands-on caretaking with the child in the leave situation. So.
As it's 1:30 now, I'm going to go to Sharon's question, then we'll have a chance maybe to dialogue just more informally. But let's have one more question if we could.
On the causation issue, but I think he's identified there's still treatment that needs to happen. But my question is it the paid leave that we have to adhere to? Is it taking leave at all, with 84 months leave, that creates a stigma and a problem? Or is it a caregiver responsibility generally when it comes to babysitting that has nothing to do with whether or not you can leave, but everything to do with the fact that you now have 1, 2, 3 kids at home, and that's going to impact your ability and your ability to do certain areas. And it was unclear from the data how you parse those three potential causations out.
Yeah.
Why is it that paid leave has to be problem?
Because of the perception of benefit, that, if you're not, well, you're familiar with the research coming back of, single people in the workforce coming back and saying, well, why should you get that paid benefit? Why should you get that paid time off? The stopped clock becomes an issue because people coming back and saying, well, why should you get your clock stopped because you went home on your paid leave and you wrote 2 articles and, good for you, but, I've still got this pressure. I've still got to perform, that kind of thing. So that's where the paid, unpaid comes in, is this question of benefit. In some senses doesn't necessarily have to be gender, but just, equity as a whole, since you're talking about it in a parental setting. And your second part was, there was a whole other point I wanted to make. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that, I was just surprised how clearly that came out, was that to an extent it was gender linked, because, we were able to show that caregiving responsibilities hit leave-taking women the hardest, but the fact that leave-taking men looked very similar to the leave-taking women I thought was pretty significant. Because going to this point where you and I are going back and forth about the framing of the question and the rationale for why you push forward in the policy, I think is really critical. Because, if you strip it all away, my fundamental argument is that we spend so much time looking to, what did you call it, the critical moment, to address this critical moment without addressing the longer term. For me, that period wasn't so hard, but then you go into trying to come back. Now you've got the child and trying to perform as the ideal worker. And meanwhile, the policy consideration has moved on, Not entirely, I'm talking to you all who are devoting your life to promoting the flexibility conversation, so clearly you're not included in that indictment. But that's my concern, is that we define women's needs fairly narrowly around the childbearing, and then expect them to come back and look pretty much the same as men.
Great. All right, I want to respect your time here, so let's, I'm going to formally end it here, but I'm going to, I'll stick around, and hopefully Charmaine can for a moment as well, if you guys have a second. But I wanted to thank Charmaine again. This is very important work. I think for me on two levels. One, just the equity issue. Even as as a guy interested in these issues, I don't think is talked about. At least when I've seen as much recently. This is a. There are other arguments around the well-being of children and the well-being of individuals, but the equity issue is not talked about as much. Secondly, the issue of unintended consequences, I think, is critical when we look more generally at policies. And I think in some ways there's become sort of a partisan split where we're sort of, some folks sort of talk frankly, I think in the Holy Grail terms about some solutions without being critical about the unintended consequences. Other folks ignore the problem altogether as if there's no problem on the other side of the aisle. And part of what we're trying to do at New America in conjunction with some other folks in the room and in town is to try to create a more reasonable conversation where we can sort of look reasonably at the fact that there are some unintended consequences about some policies. On the other hand, talk very reasonably about the fact that there's a problem that can't be ignored on the other side, and where do we come to some sort of conclusion that can provide something that is helpful to solve a problem that everyone in the room is concerned about for professional or, frankly, for personal or other reasons. So, enough of my soapbox. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks.